As Jonathan said, I am Anna Isaac. I am economics editor at The Independent, and I am here to, with the panel, hear more about Brexit's impact on trade. Our panellists have been taking it in turns to dominate the news bulletins in the past couple of days. On my left, I have Thomas Sampson, who's of the London School of Economics and the Centre for Economic Policy Studies. And on my right, I have Josh Lyon, who also works for those institutions. Both of their research has been looking at the data we now start to have that is no longer in forecast mode, but is in utilisation mode with the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, aka the Brexit trade deal. We're going to have two presentations, and then we're going to have some questions. Now, post-COVID, if you don't know how to use a QR code, where have you been? But if you prefer not to, so there's the Slido option, use the QR code, put your questions there, I'll see them on this iPad here. If you prefer not to do that, you will have the opportunity to take questions from the floor, but it is a bit more egalitarian for those of people at home if we can do both. But if you do have a question, when I throw it out to the audience, I might ask, even because you're very flat to me, to stand up, as well as put your hand up, I'm afraid. So if you don't mind getting ready for that in a bit, that'll be fine. But before we do that, we're going to go with the order on the programme. And we have Thomas Sampson with his presentation first.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some work we published yesterday. It's a collaboration with my far more brilliant co-authors, Rebecca Freeman, Kalina Manova, and Thomas Preyer. Trying to think about the effect of Brexit on UK trade so far, and to understand kind of what we can and can't say about how UK trade has responded to the shock that is Brexit over the past few years. In this audience, the kind of importance of this question probably requires no motivation. It's obviously kind of one of the key debates that has dominated when talking about Brexit is, what would the trade effects be, and how would the UK economy respond to any changes in trade that occur. If we go back to the ex-ante forecasting that happened before the referendum, economists at that stage, one of the main channels through which economists expected Brexit to hit the UK economy was through changes in trade. And to give you a sense of the magnitude of what would have been expected, a fairly kind of conventional forecast from some of the work that was done is that we might expect to see UK-EU trade fall by around 30% in the long term as a result of Brexit. Okay? So that's what we expected ex ante, and then what we are now in the position now that Brexit has happened and the Trade and Cooperation Agreement has come into force, we can start to actually see how trade has responded, and that's going to be the focus of what I'm going to talk about. So here's some kind of simple data to get us started thinking about this question. And in fact, this data is very similar to what Adam has already shown us in his talk in the first session. So what I'm plotting here is we've got exports at the top and imports at the bottom. And you can see how UK trade and also the average of trade for other G7 countries has changed since 2012. So they're normalized to be equal in 2012, and then we can see the time pattern over the next 10 years. And there's just kind of a couple of points that I would kind of make about this graph, which again is kind of very much consistent with what Adam was saying, is there's volatility in short-run trade data, right? This is quarterly data, so it does jump up and down. But broadly speaking, you can see that on both the export side and the import side, UK and G7 trade evolves relatively similarly for most of this period. There's a big downward spike when COVID happens, and then you see trade start to recover through the end of 2020. But then what we see in 2021 as the Trade and Cooperation Agreement comes into effect is a divergence. And in particular, there was kind of a strong rebound in global trade growth in 2021, which the UK did not fully benefit from. And you can see a gap emerging between the dotted line, which is the G7, and the solid line, which is the UK, for both exports and imports. Okay? So this is the point that has been made elsewhere, and John Springford, who's in the audience today, has done much more extensive work on this, showing that since the TCA has come into effect, UK trade growth has grown more slowly than comparator countries. Right? And this is an obvious concern with the performance of the UK economy over this period. Why do we see this decline in trade growth? Okay? The obvious culprit is the TCA and the new trade barriers that have been introduced as a result of Brexit. So what we want to do in this work is dig a little bit more deeply into, to what extent can we indeed attribute this poor trade performance in the UK to Brexit, or could part of the effect also be due to other shocks to the economy that are going on at the same time? The kind of key idea behind how we're going to try and do that is to compare changes in trade with the EU to changes in trade with non-EU countries. Right? So this is, again, sort of building Adam. Adam had a very nice explanation in the Q&A earlier about how we try and disentangle Brexit effects from COVID effects. Right? And the basic point is, Brexit is a shock that has hit, the UK and not the rest of the world. So that's a useful comparison we can make. Right? What we can also say is that Brexit is a shock that's primarily hit the UK's trade with the EU, not the UK's trade with other countries. The trade barriers the UK faces vis-a-vis the rest of the world have changed very little as a result of Brexit, at least so far. So to try and sort of dig into and identify what is the effect of Brexit, we're going to make a series of comparisons between how trade with the EU has changed relative to trade with non-EU countries. And, again, the underlying idea there is simply that Brexit is primarily a shock to EU trade. So to the extent that it is driving trade dynamics, we would expect to see bigger effects on EU than non-EU trade. What we're also going to do, right, you might also be concerned that, okay, so if we suppose you see growth in UK exports to the EU relative to non-EU countries, perhaps that could also reflect differential demand changes in the EU versus the rest of the world. So it's not just what's happening in the UK that matters, but also how much demand there is coming from these different regions. Right? So to try and absorb that element of the changes, we're also going to use data on US and EU trade with the EU and with non-EU countries as a way of kind of comparing how UK is changing relative to other countries' trade. And then finally, the kind of additional trick we're going to do to try and convince ourselves that we can indeed identify what is Brexit versus what is other economic shocks is we're going to analyze all these changes within very detailed products. Right? So why are we going to do this? Well, suppose energy prices go up and we start to see more trade in oil and gas and the value of energy trade goes up. Now, if the UK trades more energy with the rest of the world than the EU, say, that will mechanically drive up the UK's trade with the rest of the world. And we don't want to attribute that to a Brexit effect. So by looking within products, and we're going to use data for just over 1,000 products, we can say, are we seeing, within these products, are we seeing changes in trade with the EU versus the rest of the world? And so that's the kind of strategy we're going to take. Our data is going to cover 3 different periods. So we're going to have a baseline before the referendum. Then we'll look at what happened between the referendum and the introduction of the TCA. Right? So during that period, There were no formal changes in trade barriers between the UK and the EU. But obviously, everyone knew something was coming. So there was a lot of uncertainty. And we might also see firms kind of anticipating the changes and responding in advance of that. And then finally, we're going to have 1 year of data under the TCA, which is going to give us at least an initial indication of what is happening to UK trade under the new trade regime. So what I'm going to do now is kind of run you through the main results we find. I'm going to do that by showing you a series of charts. And all these charts are going to have the same basic structure. So I'm going to kind of try and explain how to read these charts, and I'll do it in quite a lot of detail for this chart, and then we can go through the other ones a little bit more quickly. So we're starting off here with the effect on imports. Right? So all these effects that we're reporting are our estimate of how imports from the EU into the UK have changed relative to imports from the rest of the world. Right? And so the dark line there in the center is a plot of the estimated effect by quarter, starting in 2013 and going through to the end of 2021. The blue lines, the upper and lower blue line, those mark out kind of, in statistical terms, it is the 95% confidence interval in our estimates. Informally, it's giving you a sense of how precise our estimates, we think our estimates are. So, statistically, we think that there's a 95% chance that the true effect falls within that boundary. So the narrower those boundaries are, the more confident we are about the precision of our estimates. Okay. All these estimates are relative to the pre-referendum period, right? So the interpretation is what has happened relative to the second quarter of 2016. So big takeaways from this graph. What you can see is, there is noise quarter to quarter. Trade flows are seasonal. They move around because of, lumpy shipments and fluctuate up and down from quarter to quarter. You can see that going on. But there's no obvious trend in EU relative to non-EU imports in the period between the referendum and Brexit actually taking place. So we're not seeing significant evidence of diversion of UK imports away from the EU before we actually left the EU. Then when we leave the EU in January 2021, well, that coincides with COVID, and you can see there's a steep drop there in the initial quarter of COVID. We think that is probably a COVID effect rather than a Brexit effect, and it bounces back quite quickly, so that by the end of 2020, when the TCA comes into effect, EU relative to non-EU imports are actually very similar to where they were pre-referendum. What we then see, though, is these estimates falling off a cliff. So as soon as the TCA comes into effect, we see a sharp decline in relative imports from the EU. And that, this is the first quarter. So it happens immediately in quarter one. And then roughly it's fairly flat thereafter. So what we're seeing here is around a 25% drop in relative imports from the EU upon the introduction of the TCA, right? And as someone who spends a lot of time looking at trade data, 25% drop in one quarter is a big effect that we don't typically see. So there's clear evidence here of a large TCA effect. Now I'm going to show you the exact same graph, but for exports rather than imports. So looking now at what we think happened to UK exports to the EU relative to exports to the rest of the world. Right? Here the picture is rather different. And in particular, again, we see that there's no obvious trend pre-TCA, but also we don't see a post-TCA drop-off here either. There is some decline in the first quarter, but that bounces back in Q2. And looking at this graph, there does not seem to be an obvious effect of the TCA on exports to the EU relative to the rest of the world, at least so far. Right? An important caveat with everything I'm saying is this is just year one. trade flows will often take more than a year to adjust. So there's plenty more to come as time passes, but at least initially, we are not seeing the drop-off in EU exports that we saw on the import side. Now that kind of raises a sort of interesting question: is does that mean that exporters have not been affected by the TCA? Right? There has been a lot of coverage documenting the struggles many exporters have faced with sending goods to Europe now that they face kind of new red tape and new customs regulations under the TCA. So it is a little surprising here that we're not finding an effect. Right? We were surprised by this. We have tried to push this result in many different ways. It's pretty robust. Right? It seems to genuinely be there in the data. That said, once you start to kind of unpack this and to look a little bit more beneath the surface and to understand kind of what's going on in more detail, there is clear evidence that exporters have been affected. It just doesn't seem to show up in the aggregate values. Right? So to give an example of that, let me talk about the evidence we found on trade relationships between the UK and the EU. Right? Now, kind of ideally what I would like to tell you at this point is what's happened to the number of firms exporting to the EU and how different types of firms have been affected. That data may be available in the future, but it hasn't been published yet, so we can't do that. Right? Instead, we're going to kind of try and construct an alternative measure, which is like an imperfect proxy for how many relationships there are between UK exporters and EU importers. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to count the number of very detailed products that are exported to EU countries. Right? So at the most disaggregate level we can get it, our trade data has over 10,000 products in it. Right? So these are pretty disaggregated product categories. To give an example, one of these products is umbrellas with a telescopic shaft, but not toy umbrellas. Right? So for umbrellas with a telescopic shaft, we can count how many EU countries those umbrellas are exported to each quarter. Right? And we can do the same thing for all the 10,000 other products, and we can do it for both EU countries and non-EU countries. Right? And that's going to be our measure of an export relationship between the UK and the EU. It's, do we export umbrellas in quarter 2 2021 to Slovenia? If we do, one relationship, and then let's count them all up. Right? So having constructed this measure of the number of relationships, what we're then going to ask is, how has that number of relationships with the EU changed after Brexit? And we're going to do that comparison kind of in exactly the same way we did for the values earlier. So we're going to compare EU number of relationships to the EU to the non-EU, and we're going to use US and EU trade data as controls. So here are the graphs we get when we do that. So we've got export relationships on the left, import relationships on the right. The structure of the graph is exactly the same as before. And the main thing I want you to focus on is, particularly on the export graph, you can see again we've got relative stability. There's a spike related to COVID, and then the TCA hits, and this thing really falls off a cliff. And there's about a 30% decline in the number of export relationships in the first quarter of trade under the TCA. Right? So this is evidence that a lot of exports that were previously sent to EU markets simply cease once the TCA comes into effect. Which export relationships are being affected? Okay. Well, if we break it down by looking at the kind of size of the export relationships, it's overwhelmingly lower value relationships. Right? So it's the relationships that account for kind of smaller amounts of trade and that are with smaller destination markets. So, for example, a relationship with Slovenia is much more likely to have been destroyed than a relationship with France or Germany. Right? We don't, as I was saying, we don't have the firm level data yet, but this pattern is very consistent with smaller firms stopping exporting while larger firms continue. Why is that likely to be? Well, if we think about the TCA as imposing new kind of fixed costs of trade, right? All the costs of filling in forms, meeting new regulations, dealing with all the customs procedures. For larger firms, these costs are an annoyance, but it's an annoyance that you pay and you continue trading. For smaller firms, it's an annoyance that makes it no longer profitable to do business with the EU. And so our interpretation of these results is probably that just a lot of smaller firms have ceased trading because of these new fixed costs. But the larger firms, and it's these larger firms that overwhelmingly drive aggregate export dynamics, have continued to export. And that's why we don't see an effect. That's why we think we don't see an effect on the values side, at least yet. That said, kind of, one fact we teach when we teach trade economics is that small firms don't currently account for much trade, but they are also one of the key sources of future trade growth. So if you kill off the smaller firms today, there's reasons to be concerned that this is going to have negative effects on future export growth, which obviously we will see if that does indeed happen. So to kind of sum up, what do we take away from this work? Firstly, there's this very obvious big decline in imports. We think it's around 25%. Export values have held up much better, but this stability is in a way misleading because once you look under the hood, we're seeing this destruction of trade relationships. We also see a lot of heterogeneity across different types of products. So, for example, if you look at consumer goods, you do see a fall in the value of EU exports relative to non-EU exports. To finish, I want to finish with some questions and some caveats. The asymmetry here between our import and export findings is puzzling. Right? It's even more puzzling when you take into account the fact that the UK has delayed many of the checks on imports. If you'd asked me before we did this work, I'd have said we're more likely to find an export effect than an import effect. At this stage, we don't know what is the cause of that asymmetry. Right? We can kind of speculate about it, but clearly there is more research needed here to understand exactly what is going on with UK trade. So that's kind of one, it's always nice when research can motivate future research. So, one thing is why are we seeing these asymmetric import and export effects? The other thing is, I started by showing you that UK exports underperformed in 2021, and then I said, but we don't think that was a TCA effect. That then leaves open the question, why was UK export performance so poor in 2021? All right, and that's kind of another open question that I think still needs addressing. And one possible explanation, well, could it be that UK exporters that, say, rely on imports from the EU now find those imports more expensive, and that's affecting their exports not just to the EU, but also to the rest of the world. So there are kind of spillovers from the TCA onto exports to the rest of the world. That's another question that deserves further research. And then, important caveats. We're only looking at the first year, so we don't want to draw any long-term conclusion on this. Everything I've shown you has been about goods trade. Services is, for the UK, services accounts for about half of trade. So we also want to know what happens to services trade. The services data comes out more slowly, so we haven't looked at that yet. But clearly, that's another important question. And then, there have been some data collection issues related to the exit from the EU. So thinking more carefully about whether those could have induced any bias in the data is also important. So, there's lots more work to be done in this area. But, very clearly the TCA has been already a major disruption to UK trade, and it has made life much harder for importers and also for certainly smaller exporters. I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. And we now go from Monday's headlines to yesterday's headlines, which is from the cliff edge to the shopping basket. So let's hear from Josh.
Good. So everything I'm going to talk about here is going to build very nicely on what Thomas has shown you already. So Thomas has shown very convincing evidence that UK imports have fallen as a result of Brexit. And what we do in this report is kind of show you why is that important for the UK economy, and it's important for a number of reasons. And so this is joint work with a number of colleagues who have done a lot of work on this project, some of which are in this room. So we know that Brexit created trade barriers. Some of them were introduced in 2021, although they're kind of being phased in. And in this report, we want to look at, particularly on the import side, to show you kind of how have imports changed and how has that varied across different products, but then think kind of economically, what does that mean? And we want to focus on two ways that that's going to affect the UK economy. The first one is that UK businesses use imported goods for production. So around 2/3 of imports across the world is used as inputs to production. So that's going to affect UK businesses that rely on those imports for their activities. And then secondly, as was mentioned in the first panel, we have some results that show that these changes in imports have affected food prices. And I'll talk in detail about why we focus on food and whether these effects are likely to be seen across other products. So this is just a timeline of what's happened in Brexit, and I'm putting it up here because most of what we focus on is going to be post-TCA. So most of the effects that we see are coming after the implementation of the TCA in 2021. But some of what we see is going to start to be materialized in the data from sort of the end of 2019 when this current government got elected. So I'm going to talk about kind of pre-TCA as that period 2019 to the start of 2021, and then post-TCA as that period. So just to kind of preview the key findings, as Thomas has already shown, UK imports have fallen from the EU. And in this research, most of what we're going to do is compare UK imports from the EU with UK imports from non-EU countries. So a little bit different to what Thomas is doing, where he's comparing UK imports from the EU or UK imports in total with other countries' imports volumes. And one thing we do is just to show that there's a lot of variation across products. So different products have different kind of timing and extent of changes in importing. And in the report, we show kind of various different representative products that show you in what ways different products have kind of responded in terms of their trade flows. And then what we show is that UK supply chains seem to be affected by these changes in imports. So importing is important for UK firms, and we're seeing that for some key kind of production sectors in the UK, like motor vehicles. Imports have really have fallen from the EU, and in some cases they kind of rise from non-EU, but they are being affected. And then finally, we've got this headline number that you've already heard at least once today, that Brexit trade barriers caused a 6% increase in food prices between the end of 2019 and September 2021. And I'll go through each of those in more detail now. So I'll, just like Thomas did, I'll spend a bit of time explaining what our charts show on the first chart, and then hopefully for later charts, we can go through it in slightly more detail. So this is just splitting out UK imports of goods, and we also focus on goods for exactly the same reason, that the goods data is available more punctually than services data, but services is obviously really important. So this splits out UK's imports from the EU in blue and from non-EU countries in red, and it just kind of normalizes each of those values to be 100 in January 2020. So whatever the value was at that time, fix it to 100, and then everything that comes later is just changes relative to what that initial value was in 2010. So what we see is they kind of roughly move together throughout that period, and then on the implementation of the TCA, which is the kind of second yellow line, you see that UK imports from the EU fell quite dramatically, while UK imports from non-EU countries didn't fall equivalently. But what we see is that these trends kind of vary a lot when you look across different products. So what we did was split all goods into kind of 100 different categories and then produce this same graph that you've just seen for each of those goods. And kind of a number of key trends occur in terms of sort of the extent of the deviation between EU imports and non-EU imports, and the timing with which those kind of trends are taking place. And so here I just want to show you two examples. So this is UK imports of vegetables, roots and tubers, which are many things that you have in your fridge at home, but this is a kind of technical trade data term. But what you see is that UK imports from the EU and non-EU move kind of roughly together. There's not really a significant deviation before the implementation of the TCA, but then imports from the EU kind of fall while imports from non-EU countries rise, and it's kind of quite striking that the timing just kind of comes in exactly on 2021. So we see that UK importers seem to be adjusting their imports from EU countries to non-EU countries. This is the same chart, but for textiles, so they don't follow quite as closely in the kind of pre-period, but the key point that we want to make is that you start to see divergence before the implementation of the TCA. So if you look at how kind of close together the two lines are in 2016 at the referendum, they're much further apart by the time it gets to kind of just before the implementation of the TCA, and then they kind of diverge further. And what we see here as well is some evidence of stockpiling from the EU. So you can see a spike in December 2020, where it looks like UK importers were kind of importing large volumes for textiles, something that can clearly be stored, which is an important point when we come on to talking about food later and why we see effects on food prices. And so we see kind of evidence of stockpiling. And as I said, in the report, we do kind of this chart for 6 different products and talk about how representative they are and what other products look kind of the same. And we have these charts for every product in the UK, every goods product in the UK. So if anyone has a particular good that they're interested in the trade patterns of, please do send us an email and we can send you the relevant chart. Now, kind of looking at imports is interesting, but what we want to kind of move on to doing now is to think about which kind of UK industries are affected by changes in imports of those products. So car companies use imports of tyres, say, heavily, as well as other kind of imports in their production. And what's happened to, if we kind of aggregate over all of those different inputs that are imported into the car industry, what happens to their imports? So as I said at the beginning, 2/3 of international trade is in intermediate imports. So this is clearly really important. So most of these imports are used by UK firms in their production. And there's previous evidence that shows that these intermediate imports can affect productivity. So if you have cheaper access to intermediate imports, that makes makes production more productive. You get more output for your input, and it can also affect employment and wages. So just a couple of lines on what we're actually doing here exactly. So the ONS, the Office for National Statistics, produces these what they're called input-output tables. So it tells you for every industry how much of each product do they import from abroad in terms of as a share kind of their, or we compute then the share of each product that is imported that goes into their production. And what we're going to do is essentially kind of use those shares to average over as weights when we kind of average over the national level changes in imports that we see from the EU and the non-EU countries. So when I show you a chart, hopefully it will be a bit clearer. And again, we're only focusing on imports. Oops, sorry. Let me skip that. So what you see here is essentially the same chart, but instead of plotting imports, what you see here is for the motor vehicles industry, how has the UK's imports changed of products that are important for that industry to use for its production. So 20% of the motor vehicles industry production costs, or just under 20%, is imported products classified as motor vehicles themselves. So, 20% of the total costs, including labour costs and everything that they purchase from UK industries and capital costs and everything else that's imported, is imports of other things classified as motor vehicles. So it might be tyres or a car bonnet or whatever it is. And so what you see is that imports of those things for the motor vehicles industry have fallen from the EU relative to from non-EU countries. Which is important, right? It's showing that industries are having to diverge their supply chains from EU countries to non-EU countries. And here's just another example. So this is fish production. And so we've done this for both kind of fresh fish and preserved fish products. And they use various inputs like imported fish, unsurprisingly, but also things like pharmaceuticals. And what you see again is like a clear divergence, some of which happens kind of before 2021, which partly is to do with COVID, of course. But by the time we get into 2021, there's just a huge divergence in where fishing industry imports are coming from in terms of whether they're from the EU or from non-EU countries. And again, so we've done this for every product in the UK, and this, just to stress, this is again only goods imports. But in the report, we show kind of 6 different products for which we think they have kind of representative trends of other trends that we're seeing in other products across the UK. And again, get in touch if you have a particular industry that you're interested in the trends of. So finally, I want to spend quite a bit of time going through this impact of Brexit on consumer prices that's in the headlines this morning across many places. So we begin by constructing a novel data set where we match UK trade flows to the Office for National Statistics data on consumer prices. So the ONS, to compute their aggregate CPI variable that you'll see in the headlines, what they do is collect very disaggregated price data on every product and then aggregate it all up into that one number. And so we take the kind of really disaggregated data and we match that to the trade flows data. And so you can see for every kind of disaggregated product, or at least for the ones that we're able to match, you can see both its price in the UK that you get on the shelves, and you can see how much we imported from the EU and from outside the EU. And so the reason why we focus on food in the report, and this was something we did kind of straight away, was to split out food products, is that this is a place where we'd, using this methodology, expect to see pass-through of trade onto prices. One of the main reasons for that is that food is perishable. So if we look in each month at what are the imports of a particular food product, so it might be potatoes or whatever, we might expect to see a correlation between changes in food in that month with the price of food in that month, which is obviously different to something like textiles that we saw before, where it can be stockpiled, the price might take a while to pass through. So that's one of the reasons why we focused on food. Secondly, as I mentioned before, at least once, I think twice, a lot of international trade is in intermediate products, but food tends to be kind of imported in its final form. So, if we looked at the price of, say, semiconductors on the UK consumer shelves and imports of semiconductors, we might not see that much pass-through because, or semiconductors wasn't a good example. Something that takes a lot of other intermediate inputs. We might not see much pass-through, but because food, you import a potato, it goes onto the shelf as a potato. There's nothing else that's going in there. There's not that much processing that's done in the UK. Therefore, we'd expect to see some kind of pass-through between the imports and food prices. And then finally, we know that there are a lot of barriers to trade in food, and we think that that's kind of the main reason that would drive changes in prices that you see on the shelves. And so what we show is that products more reliant on EU imports have had significantly higher price growth. When we repeat the same exercise for all of the other products that we see in the data, that we can match in data, we don't see that same effect, which isn't to say that we kind of rule that out, that there's been an effect of Brexit on prices in other industries. Maybe the effect was less, but it's partly methodological for the reasons that I explained that we focused on food. And I'm going to show you a chart and talk a little bit about the methodology of how we think that we can kind of rule out COVID-19 and various lockdowns as a driver of these changes. So ignore most of the information on the slide, but the key thing that we're going to do here is that we want to compare we want to compare the prices of products that are really reliant on imports from the EU with products that are less reliant on imports from the EU. So, something that we don't import much from the EU, such as lamb, a lot of it comes from outside the EU. We see smaller import shares. We're less reliant on the EU. We're less likely to see a price effect pick up, given that we haven't seen significant changes in kind of trade barriers with non-EU countries with the rollover of most of the kind of third-party trade agreements. In comparison, something that we import from the EU, is much more exposed to these new trade barriers. We're therefore more likely to pick up a price effect. So this is kind of the natural experiment, to use Adam's word from earlier, that we're going to exploit here. And we're going to do it in kind of two ways, which I'll talk about a little bit in more detail now. So this is kind of our key chart. There's quite a lot going on, so I'll try and kind of talk you through it slowly. So what the points, the kind of bubbles are showing, what's the average kind of price difference between products that are exposed to the EU versus products that are kind of not exposed to the EU. So, the kind of bars that come out from that tell us how reliable do we think those estimates are? How much variation is there in the data? So like how precise can we be about that difference between products that are exposed from the EU and exposed to the EU and products that are less exposed to the EU? So in all the cases in the lead up to the referendum where the bars kind of cross the zero line, what that's saying is that there's no kind of statistically significant difference between the prices of food products that are more exposed to the EU and the prices of food products that are less exposed to the EU. And that's good, because that means that later on when we pick up differences between those two groups of products, it's likely to be to do with something that's changed, because in the lead up to that product, in the lead up to the changes due to Brexit, these two groups of products, they're moving similarly together. So if you think about those charts that I showed you earlier, this is a similar kind of thing to saying that those two lines from the EU and the non-EU, they're moving together before anything happens with Brexit. And then what we see is after the implementation of the TCA, those things are no longer, these kind of bars are no longer crossing the zero line, and they're above the zero line. And what that tells you is that products that are more exposed to the EU, we import more of them from the EU, have higher price growth than products that we import less of from the EU. And that's kind of the key finding. And what I want to highlight is that we see, so this red line is the 2019 general election. And what we see is, you kind of can't see it so much here, but we see that the prices of those products start to rise in anticipation before, in that period, but crucially kind of before anything happened to do with the pandemic. And during the period of the pandemic, if we split this thing out by months, so these are quarters, but we can split it out monthly, we don't see any correlation in the changes with kind of events that happen with COVID. So it's not like the lockdowns are happening, that's driving this difference between EU imports and non-EU imports. It does seem to be lined up exactly with the implementation of the TCA and a little bit of anticipatory effects when the current government got into power, and it became clear that we're going to have a Brexit where the UK is going to leave the customs union and the single market, or confirmed further. And I should say we're also controlling for kind of aggregate macro trends here. So these are all kind of taking out the average change in price in the UK economy in any given quarter, and just focusing on the difference between the products that are more exposed and less exposed. And so if we do the same thing, but rather than kind of splitting it out month by month, just kind of aggregating over the whole post-TCA period, we get a kind of aggregate price change after the TCA relative to the before the TCA. And from that, we can compute this 6% number. So I'm not going to show you any of the tables for your sakes, but trust me on the fact that we can then compute out this 6% number. And I'll stop there.
Well, those were both absolutely fascinating. I think we're very lucky with some of the talent we have in the room today, and perhaps lucky in the UK that we have this infrastructure of think tanks and economists so that we can analyse this phenomenal impact. I'm going to selfishly ask a question, so now's a good moment if you have a burning question to refine it, get it in on Slido, or we'll also come to the room as well. But to be selfish and take a panel privilege. Thomas, I guess my question for you first up is anyone actually using the TCA?
That's a very good question. So, and what I think you mean there is, are people actually using the tariff-free rates rather than just paying the tariffs, right? That's what you're getting at. So the EU publishes data on for imports into the EU from the UK. We know what share of imports enter tariff-free versus paying tariffs. I'm going to apologise that I don't have the exact number in my head, but I think it's around 70 to 80% by value of imports, EU imports, are entering tariff-free. So most UK exporters are using the TCA, but clearly not all are, right? And that's why we need to be a bit careful when talking about the TCA. It's a zero tariff, zero quota deal, but only if you meet the rules of origin. And not all exporters meet the rules of origin. About 20 to 25% of UK exports are actually still paying tariff on exports to the EU. I haven't seen comparable data from the UK side yet, but when we do, we'll get a sense of whether EU exporters are using the TCA, and also that might change when the UK finally actually implements import checks, which currently we're not really doing.
Brilliant, thank you. Absolutely fascinating work. And one question I had for you, Josh, before we go to the floor, is to what extent do you think trade displacement is occurring, and that being part of this story of higher food inflation? I'm thinking particularly given some of the rollovers that were challenging for some African nations that trade in food with the UK.
So definitely when we kind of split out by product the trade flows data, we're seeing clear evidence of diversion in trade to non-EU countries for specific products. Whether that's kind of driving the food price result, I think we kind of rule out that it's not, because what we're doing is isolating the difference between products that are exposed to EU imports versus non-EU imports. So we're kind of, that's what we're driving. But what we do want to do is kind of split out more the countries that are being traded with for each of these food products, and see if we can kind of shed more light on to what extent diversion might be able to kind of mitigate the food price rises that we're seeing in the data.
Brilliant. And if anyone wants to send one of those special requests to Josh, feel free to CC me. I'd absolutely love to find out. Right. Okay. So if we could start with, we'll take a question from the room, and we're gonna alternate. So let's take 2 questions from the room, and then we'll come to Slido. I'm going to ask you, and I know it's annoying, if you could stand up if you have a question, so that I can actually see who's got one. Have we got any questions from women in the room? I'll take that as a no. Okay, we've got a question right at the back, sir. We've got a roving microphone. Thank you so much.
John Springford from the Centre for European Reform. Thanks for the shout out, Thomas. I just had a question about whether trade with the EU is fully independent from trade with non-EU sources. And there are a couple of reasons why you might worry about that. One is that we know that the single market has generally been trade creating with countries outside the EU, so leaving it might reduce trade with countries outside the EU. And thinking about why that might happen, well, if you're an importer of inputs from the EU and you're suddenly going to face trade barriers, then you might say, right, I'm going to go to the rest of the world for my products, and vice versa if you're an exporter. So I just wondered if you could talk a bit more about that. That would be great.
Are we going to take another question?
If we can take one more from the room before we go around. This gentleman here, if you can say who you are and where you come from. The mic's just on its way, sir, if you wait a moment. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Bernard Casey. I've come from Frankfurt for this. I'm interested in motor cars as opposed to food, so this is a bit more in Thomas's direction. What one knows about motor car production is that even items like screws that go into a car not only come from somewhere and go into the car, but actually go backwards and forwards very many times. To what extent is this backwards and forwards being reflected? I presume it is, but can you say a little bit more about it in the results that you showed for motor cars? Thank you.
Okay, we'll deal with those two questions first. If, Thomas, we could go to you on the EU versus non-EU question from John Springford, then we'll go to Josh on that same question before we come to cars.
Okay, great. Thanks for the question, John. I mean, I think you make a really good point, and I think I essentially agree with everything you said. Our approach was to try and isolate the kind of differential EU versus non-EU effect. But as you point out, there are good reasons why we might also expect to see that shocks to EU trade costs have spillover effects on trade with the rest of the world. So, I think the substantive implication of that observation is about how you interpret our results. It would be a mistake to interpret our results as saying this is the complete and total effects of the TCA. Instead, what we're kind of identifying is the partial effect on EU relative to non-EU trade. The reason we think that's interesting is that, though these spillover effects we would expect to exist, and we hope to do future work looking at them, I think, again, with firm level data, you could try and look at exactly those things. Do we see firms that import more from the EU start exporting less to the rest of the world when the TCA hit? That will be a really interesting question to look at that we don't have the data for yet. But, even kind of with that, we would still expect that there is a larger effect on EU trade than non-EU trade, because obviously EU trade, you're not only facing those effects, but you're also facing the additional costs. So we were kind of interested in how big that effect is, and that's kind of what we've picked up so far. But as you say, it leaves kind of lots of future work to do.
And Josh, if you'd like to address that.
I completely agree that there's likely to be diversion across countries. So what we do differently to what Thomas is doing is compare UK trade with EU countries with non-EU countries. It's probably even more likely to be spillovers that you'd see on the non-EU side. And what we do on the kind of trade side and in the product level analysis is exactly that. So we try and look at for which products are we seeing rises in imports from the non-EU countries, and for which ones are we not seeing that? And kind of, we'd like to try and explain why for some products do we see that diversion, and why for other products do we not see that diversion. And I think that's a really interesting question. Specifically on the methodology of like the price change research, we fixed the exposure share to 2015 for exactly that reason. So we take the exposure of imports of each product to the EU in 2015, and we don't look at any trade data beyond that point, for precisely that reason, that like if you looked at the difference between UK imports from the EU and non-EU countries in 2021 for countries, for cases where you kind of see a big diversion to non-EU countries, you'd see a big opening up of the gap between imports from the EU and from the non-EU countries. But you might expect to see less on the price side, right? Because you're substituting your imports from EU countries to non-EU countries. So for methodological reasons, we just hold that fixed to 2015.
Brilliant. And then, Thomas, we come to Bernard's questions about the screw that moves back and forth and how we deal with that kind of a problem, particularly in the car industry.
Yeah. I mean, so purely as a measurement issue, the way trade statistics are collected, every time it crossed a border, that would be recorded in trade statistics. So if that screw is going back and forth 10 times between the UK and the EU, that would count 10 times in trade statistics. Now, as you kind of alluding to, that kind of raises a question of, how do we actually want to measure the amount of trade that's going on here? So there have been attempts to measure what's typically referred to as trade in value added, rather than just the total amount of trade, where if you had trade in value added statistics, you'd count that screw essentially the first time it crossed the border, and then from then on it wouldn't get counted. So there are alternative trade data sets which are kind of strip out the multiple border crossings. That's not what we've used in our work, primarily because, as you can imagine, doing that stripping out requires some additional data, and so that data becomes available more slowly and isn't available for as yet for the period, for the most recent years. But it would be an interesting extension of our work to see if you got different results if you looked at value-added trade rather than gross trade.
I mean, would that also affect those relationships? Because with little things like that, that was what I was also considering.
It's not obvious to me that there is kind of a clear way it would lead to a bias in the results we are finding there. Because as long as, suppose it's trade back and forth between a plant in Poland and the UK, as long as it's crossed once, we would observe that as happening.
Okay, so now we turn to Slido. This has been marked as a question for Thomas. It comes from Jill Rutter, who is a fellow UK in a Changing Europe.
Sitting just there.
Yeah, I've seen, I can see Jill, a familiar face. She's asking primarily for Thomas, but I actually think given the UK's role in terms of food processing and some of the logistics that might go on there, it will also be perhaps relevant for Josh. He will decide that. But this is the question. Could the reluctance of EU logistics firms / truck drivers explain some of the fall in imports from the EU?
That's a good question. It seems very plausible that it could. I don't have any data to specifically shed light on that. But obviously, trade has to go both directions across the border, and if even if the UK has not imposed import checks, but if truckers know that if they come to the EU they're going to face checks, so if they come to the UK they're going to face checks when they leave, that could at the very least increase the cost of hiring those services. So I think it seems likely that could play a role. I don't have any way of kind of quantifying how important that is at this stage.
I guess any disruptions such as that you noted?
Well, I'd just say that one of the reasons why we focused on food is because we think it's exposed to those kind of changes. So, if there are delays at the border, if you've got a food product that needs to hit the shelves quickly, you're more likely to see disruptions. And so, we think that it's more likely to be playing a role in food and the pass-through of trade to prices than it might do in another sector where, it's not perishable or it doesn't rely on kind of just-in-time supply chains. And
a question now from Stephen Boxall, which I'm going to take a slight liberty with. Apologies, Steve. Stephen is asking, why would importers switch from EU suppliers to non-EU ones? They now have to complete import paperwork for both, so friction to trade is the same. And I suppose what I'd ask is in your responses both, if we could think about the international examples where we might have low or no tariffs, so comparable tariff quota rates as we do with the TCA. So if you can pin down a particular product, I think that would be particularly pertinent to Stephen's question there. Or if not, because the TCA is very unusual in its tariff-free, quota-free construction, perhaps we can draw on that more. But if we could go to Thomas first and then Josh.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to do a very good job of pinning down a particular product. I might leave that to Josh. But the way I would think about this is what matters is not simply the trade costs, but also how much exporters that you're buying from in other countries are selling the good for. So previously, when we were part of the EU, you might have sourced goods from France, even if French exporters were more expensive than, say, American exporters, because once you accounted for the fact that the American exporters may have been cheaper initially, but then you had higher trade costs, then they ended up more expensive at the end of the day. So it's that kind of combination of what is the price that they're actually selling for, plus the trade costs that matters. So, to answer his question, previously you may have sourced from French exporters because even though they were more expensive, they had lower trade costs. Now, if they now face the same trade costs as the US, then you're going to switch and source from the US. So I think it's that combination of thinking about how much does the good cost plus the trade cost that's the way to understand what's going on here.
And Josh, are you also seeing this somewhat gravity-defying effect, or how would you explain it?
Well, I'd kind of reiterate what Thomas said, but I think another way to put it would be that even though the trade costs might be the same now from EU countries and non-EU countries, there's been a change in kind of the relative trade costs. So the trade cost from the EU has increased, while the trade cost from other countries perhaps has not changed by so much. And this is kind of important for the supply chain work that we're kind of trying to highlight, because if before it was efficient for you to source something from the EU and that trade cost has risen, but everything else has stayed the same, when you switch your sourcing to a non-EU country, or indeed leave it from the EU but with a higher trade cost, that's going to have kind of pass-through effects onto your production activities in the UK, which is likely to affect, labour markets and things more broadly.
And I'm going to be very greedy and myself ask another question before we have perhaps one more from Slido, or if you're really desperate from the floor, we may come back to you as well. But I guess for both of you, I'd love to know how, given that we have sort of three different structures that are all interrelated. We have the withdrawal agreement, we have the trade and cooperation agreement, and we have, of course, the Northern Ireland Protocol. How are you accounting for the impact of what isn't, your data relies on the border, you've explained that. It's when it passes through that border, it clicks into the system and it gets recorded. How do we deal with that when we have this very unique relationship with the trade border that is in Northern Ireland?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's a difficult one to answer. I mean, I think maybe kind of we can sort of think about it in two parts. One is that for aggregate overall UK trade, and apologies to anyone who might be Northern Irish, Northern Ireland doesn't matter. Northern Ireland is 2% of the UK economy. It's incredibly small. We've spent a lot of time talking about it in the context of Brexit for obvious reasons, right? And it matters for lots of political reasons, and in terms of maintaining peace and stability on the island of Ireland. It doesn't matter for the overall UK economy. So I think it is a reasonable first pass when you're looking at the UK economy as a whole to pretend Northern Ireland doesn't exist, right? And apologies if that offends anyone, but that's a pretty sensible way to proceed. There's then a kind of more interesting answer, though, which is we're now in this very unusual positions where we have customs checks within the country, right? We don't just have customs checks with other countries, we now have customs checks between Britain and Northern Ireland. And that's going to give us this unique opportunity to learn about what happens when you actually put kind of customs checks within a country, which is something we haven't really seen since, I think, the 19th century, when 19th century states used to do this. We don't have the data to do that yet. Again, I come back to data availability. But at some point, we're going to get a really rich data set on trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and that's going to be fascinating to study exactly what the effects of the Northern Ireland Protocol are. And I think we will learn a lot from that in future. And
Josh, yeah, for you.
Well, so far, we only really look at timing. So we're not trying to tease out the effects of different parts of different agreements. But so far we're kind of just looking at this time what happened to trade flows, and we know roughly what's happening at what time. But it's clearly really important to start thinking about what are the types of trade barriers that are going to be affecting trade. And one of the kind of more difficult things with Brexit is that all of these trade barriers are non-tariff. So historically, trade economists have used tariffs, and they're really nice to work with because they're a number and you can compare it across sectors, and then you can look at what happens to trade flows. One of the hard things with Brexit is that these barriers are kind of not tariffs. So we're having to kind of think of different ways to work out how exposed different products are to changes in trade barriers. And Thomas and I are kind of starting to try and get at that in other work.
Brilliant. We've got a question from Anonymous, which is, how do we address methodological changes in the way data is collected for analysis, particularly looking forward now as collection methods have changed in 2022? And I'd ask for both of you to come in on that one, and particularly if there isn't a methodological point, which bit of data that the government already collates you most want them to release now? So if...
Josh, do you want to go first?
Yeah,
I'll let you go first.
I'll definitely leave the methodological question to you, because I know you're the expert on that, and have the author of some excellent Twitter threads. So I'll leave that part to you. In terms of the data, I mean, I'd definitely like to see the service. I do a lot of work on services trade, and I'd like to have the services trade data more detailed, firstly, across the products that it happens, and then that it's recorded, and kind of more timely and kind of better microdata across the country. But that would be my preference.
Just the small matter of 80% of the UK economy, absolutely. Okay, and Thomas, we have all read your threads; they're great. But the methodological points of beef, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, so the issue for those of you who haven't been following the details of how trade data is collected is that when we were a member of the EU, data on trade within the EU couldn't be collected from customs declarations, which is the normal way of collecting trade data, because there weren't any, because that was the great thing about being part of the customs union. So it was instead collected through a survey called the Intrastat survey. Having now left the EU, and this happened for exports last year and for imports this year, trade data is now collected through customs declarations. So there's this methodological change in how the data is collected. And that raises the question is, if you had collected the same, you used the two methods to collect data for the same year, would you have found the same statistics? It was suggested to the government that they might want to run the two surveys in parallel, the two methods in parallel for a time, so that we could assess this. They neglected to do that for whatever reason. So there is this kind of outstanding problem. So for exports, when we switched from the Intrastat survey to customs declarations, does that mean we now measure more trade or less trade or roughly the same trade? Do those biases differ for different products? That's the problem we face. I think, and I'm going to kind of link this now to, what data would I really like? Please give us the firm level trade data. It does exist. It is collected. It would be really nice to have it. It is supposed to come out, but just the sooner we can get our hands on that, and the more other firm level surveys we can match it to, the more we can learn about what is going on. And in particular, with that firm level trade data will hopefully help us to understand whether there are some biases from this change in survey methods, because we'd be able to look for, for individual firms, how has their trade changed over time? And if we see kind of some, essentially really bizarre changes at the firm level, that might be an indicator that there are problems with the change in data collection methods. So that's what I would like to do.
Lovely, lovely to end on an extremely geeky point. And so it just leaves me to say a tremendous thank you to our two very learned panellists, and to say, keep up the headline domination, please. More trade in the news. I think it's going to be important in the weeks and months ahead, particularly with food and the situation in Ukraine. And thank you for being a fantastic audience and listening so attentively. Thank you so much.